Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Steffi's shocking slap is not merely an impulsive act of anger but a seismic emotional rupture that tears through the already fragile fabric of her family, exposing layers of betrayal, denial, and long-suppressed resentment, and as her hand connects with Katie in that explosive instant, it becomes painfully clear that this is the culmination of years of festering wounds rather than a single moment gone wrong. Because Steffi has spent so long trying to hold together a sense of loyalty, identity, and moral certainty in a world that constantly demands compromise, and when she realizes that Katie's role in Bill Spencer's manipulations is far deeper and more personal than she ever allowed herself to believe, the shock manifests physically, violently, and irreversibly, turning a private realization into a public reckoning that leaves everyone in the room stunned. As Katie reels not just from the sting of the slap but from the crushing weight of finally being seen for the choices she tried to justify as love, protection, or necessity, while Steffi stands frozen in the aftermath, her anger giving way to devastation as she understands that by striking Katie she has crossed a line she can never fully retreat from, yet at the same time has spoken a truth that words alone could never convey, and in that charged silence Bill Spencer's world begins to crumble. Because the carefully constructed empire of control, power, and emotional manipulation he has relied on for decades is suddenly exposed as hollow, built on lies that have poisoned the very people he claimed to protect, and Bill, who has always believed himself untouchable, finds that Steffi's action has shattered the illusion of his dominance, forcing him to confront the reality that his influence has cost him the trust of those he loves most, as Katie's pain becomes not only physical but existential. Realizing that she has been complicit in sustaining a cycle of secrecy that ultimately destroys the family she thought she was saving, and her tears are not just for herself but for the realization that her moral justifications crumble under the weight of Steffi's raw, undeniable fury, while Steffi herself is caught between righteous anger and unbearable guilt, knowing that the slap will forever define this moment, branding her as both victim and aggressor, truth-teller and destroyer, and as the family fractures further, old arguments resurface, accusations fly, and every character is forced to choose whether they will continue to protect Bill's legacy of manipulation or finally break free from it, and Bill, stripped of his usual bravado, is left staring at the wreckage of relationships he once controlled so effortlessly, realizing too late that power cannot substitute for honesty, that fear cannot replace love, and that the loyalty he demanded was never truly earned. As Steffi's action becomes the catalyst for a long-overdue confrontation about accountability, responsibility, and the emotional cost of silence, and even as Katie struggles to stand both physically and emotionally, she is confronted with the undeniable truth that her choices, however well-intentioned, have contributed to a culture of betrayal that now consumes them all, while Steffi's internal conflict deepens as she grapples with the fear that she has become what she despises, someone who uses force when words fail. Yet cannot deny that the slap has finally pierced through the layers of denial that polite conversation never could, and the ripple effects of that single act spread outward, affecting not just the immediate family but everyone connected to Bill's empire, forcing allies to question their loyalties and enemies to seize the moment, as the narrative shifts from one of quiet manipulation to open warfare, emotional and moral lines drawn in stark relief, and in the aftermath the family is left to navigate the ruins of trust, wondering whether reconciliation is even possible when the truth has been revealed in such a brutal, unforgettable way, because Steffi's slap is not just an act of violence but a declaration that she will no longer be silent, no longer complicit, no longer willing to sacrifice her integrity for the illusion of family unity, and as Bill retreats into himself, confronted by the realization that his greatest weakness has always been his inability to face the consequences of his actions, the story becomes less about who was right or wrong in that single moment and more about how a lifetime of unchecked power and emotional manipulation inevitably leads to collapse, leaving behind a family that must either rebuild on a foundation of honesty or continue to crumble under the weight of its own secrets, and in this sense Steffi's shocking slap stands as both a tragic failure of restraint and a necessary rupture, a moment that destroys illusions, exposes betrayal, and forces every character to confront who they truly are when the lies finally run out. In the devastating aftermath of the slap, the emotional shockwaves continue to surge through the family like an aftershock that refuses to settle, because what Steffi unleashed in that instant cannot be undone or neatly repaired, and as the room slowly empties, leaving behind fractured silences and unspoken accusations, each character retreats into their own reckoning, forced to confront the version of themselves they have long avoided, with Steffy Forrester standing at the center of it all. Haunted by the realization that while the slap exposed the truth, it also stripped her of the moral high ground she fought so hard to protect, and yet even as guilt gnaws at her, she cannot fully regret the act because it shattered a cycle of polite dishonesty that had suffocated her for years, leaving her to wonder whether healing can ever emerge from such violence or whether she has simply accelerated the family's collapse. While Katie Logan, alone with her thoughts and the echo of Steffy's fury, spirals into a profound identity crisis, questioning not just her loyalty to Bill but her own sense of right and wrong, as she replays every compromise she made in the name of love and protection, now recognizing how easily good intentions can become shields for betrayal, and the physical pain fades faster than the emotional devastation, because what truly wounds Katie is the clarity that Steffy's rage brought with it, forcing her to accept that by protecting Bill she enabled his worst impulses, sacrificing transparency for stability and ultimately losing both, while Bill Spencer, stripped of his usual bravado, withdraws into a rare and unsettling silence, his isolation more revealing than any outburst, because for the first time he cannot intimidate, charm, or manipulate his way out of the consequences, and as he surveys the ruins of his relationships, he is confronted with the terrifying possibility that his power has always been conditional, dependent on fear and loyalty rather than genuine love, and now that fear has transformed into anger and loyalty into resentment, leaving him profoundly alone. While the wider family begins to fracture along emotional fault lines, with allies quietly distancing themselves and critics emboldened to speak truths long suppressed, as whispers turn into open confrontations and old grievances resurface with renewed intensity, and Steffy finds herself both supported and condemned, praised for her courage by some and judged harshly by others who see only the violence of her action rather than the desperation behind it, and this division forces her into a deeper self-examination, questioning whether strength must always manifest as control or whether true courage lies in vulnerability, apology, and the willingness to face consequences head-on, even when those consequences threaten to dismantle everything she has built, while Katie's journey becomes one of painful accountability, as she begins to understand that forgiveness cannot be demanded or rushed, that it must be earned through honesty and change, and she wrestles with the fear that the family may never trust her again, that she may forever be seen as an accomplice rather than a protector, and this fear drives her to confront Bill in a way she never has before, not with pleading or justification but with raw truth, forcing him to see the damage his need for control has inflicted, and though Bill initially resists, clinging to his belief that power equates to survival, cracks begin to form as he recognizes the emptiness of his victories, the hollowness of an empire built on fear rather than connection, and as these confrontations unfold, the narrative shifts from explosive drama to a slower, more devastating emotional unraveling, where each conversation cuts deeper than the slap ever could, because words now carry the weight of long-suppressed truths, and Steffy, watching the family struggle to redefine itself without lies, is forced to confront her own role not just as a catalyst but as a participant in the cycle of control and resistance, realizing that breaking free requires more than exposing betrayal, it requires choosing a different way forward, even when that path is uncertain and lonely, and as the family grapples with whether reconciliation is possible or whether some wounds are simply too deep, the story evolves into a meditation on accountability, power, and the cost of silence, showing that while a single moment of violence can expose the truth, it is the slow, painful work of honesty that determines whether the ruins left behind will become the foundation for something stronger or the final proof that some families, once broken, can never fully be repaired. As the days stretch on after the explosive confrontation, the emotional fallout refuses to fade, instead settling into the family like a slow-burning ache that colors every interaction, every glance, every silence, because what was exposed in that single, violent moment cannot simply be buried again, and Steffy Forrester finds herself trapped in an unfamiliar emotional limbo where certainty has been replaced by doubt, as the adrenaline of righteous anger gives way to exhaustion and the haunting question of whether truth delivered through pain can ever truly lead to healing, and she begins to realize that while the slap shattered illusions, it also stripped away the emotional armor she relied on to survive in a family defined by power struggles and manipulation, leaving her vulnerable in ways she never anticipated, as she replays the moment, not with pride but with a growing awareness of how deeply violence, even when fueled by truth, scars everyone involved, and yet she cannot deny that without it the lies would still be intact, the betrayal still hidden beneath polite smiles, and this contradiction becomes the emotional axis on which her identity now turns, forcing her to confront who she wants to be in a family that no longer functions on silence, while Katie Logan undergoes a quieter but equally devastating transformation, retreating from the role of mediator and protector she has played for so long and instead confronting the uncomfortable reality that her need to keep the peace often came at the cost of truth, and as she reflects on her choices, she begins to see how easily love can become control when fear of loss outweighs moral clarity, realizing that by shielding Bill from consequences she denied him the chance to change and herself the chance to live honestly, and this realization does not bring immediate redemption but rather a deep, lingering grief for the person she believed she was versus the one she now sees reflected back at her through Steffi's fury, while Bill Spencer, isolated in a way he has never experienced, begins to feel the true cost of his empire, discovering that without loyalty enforced by fear, without relationships sustained by manipulation, he is left with power that feels strangely hollow, and as he sits alone with his thoughts, memories of past victories feel less triumphant and more accusatory, each one a reminder of a relationship bent or broken to serve his will, and though he initially resists self-reflection, anger slowly gives way to something more unsettling, regret, not the performative kind meant to restore control, but a raw, disorienting awareness that he may have finally pushed the people he loves beyond the point of return, and this awareness forces him into an internal battle between doubling down on control or risking vulnerability, a risk that terrifies him more than any external threat ever could, as the family as a whole begins to splinter into uneasy alliances and quiet estrangements, with some members advocating for accountability and change while others cling desperately to the familiarity of old patterns, fearing that without Bill's dominance the family will lose its sense of structure altogether, and this tension turns ordinary conversations into emotional minefields, where every word carries the weight of unresolved conflict, and Steffi, watching these dynamics unfold, starts to understand that exposing betrayal was only the first step, that real transformation demands sustained courage, the kind that shows up not in dramatic gestures but in uncomfortable conversations, apologies that do not seek immediate forgiveness, and boundaries that may permanently alter relationships, and as she wrestles with the urge to withdraw entirely from the family to protect herself, she is confronted by the realization that disengagement, while tempting, would simply replicate the cycle of avoidance that allowed betrayal to thrive in the first place. While Katie's path toward accountability becomes increasingly public and painful, as she chooses to stop defending her past actions and instead openly acknowledge the harm they caused, knowing full well that honesty may cost her relationships she once relied on for stability, and this choice marks a profound shift in her character, as she relinquishes the illusion of control she maintained through compromise and instead embraces the uncertainty of living without guarantees, while Bill's struggle reaches a breaking point when he is finally forced to confront the possibility that love cannot be coerced, that loyalty demanded is not loyalty at all, and that the fear he inspired was never the same as respect, and though this realization does not immediately transform him, it cracks the foundation of his worldview, creating space for the possibility of change even as he resists it, and as these individual journeys intersect, the family faces a collective reckoning about what it truly means to be connected, whether shared history is enough to justify continued harm, and whether forgiveness is possible without genuine transformation. And Steffi, standing at the center of this reckoning, begins to redefine strength not as dominance or moral certainty but as the willingness to sit with discomfort, to accept responsibility for her own actions without diminishing the truth they revealed, and to choose a future that prioritizes integrity over control, even if that future means redefining what family looks like altogether, and in this extended aftermath the slap becomes less a moment of violence and more a symbol of rupture, a point of no return that forces every character to confront the cost of their choices, revealing that while betrayal may fracture relationships, it is the refusal to change that ultimately destroys them, leaving the family at a crossroads where the path forward, though painful and uncertain, offers the only chance for something more honest to emerge from the ruins. In the long stretch of time that follows, When the immediacy of shock has faded and the rawness of the confrontation has settled into something heavier and more enduring, the family begins to understand that the slap was not an ending but the beginning of a slow, painful transformation that none of them can escape, because once truth has been forced into the open it refuses to quietly retreat, and Steffi Forrester feels this more acutely than anyone, carrying the weight of being both the catalyst and the symbol of rupture, as she navigates a reality where her name is spoken in hushed tones, where some see her as the only one brave enough to break the cycle while others reduce her to the violence of that single act, and this duality gnaws at her, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth that being right does not always feel righteous, and that moral clarity rarely comes without collateral damage. And as she reflects on her own upbringing, the lessons she absorbed about strength, control, and survival, she begins to see how easily those lessons can morph into weapons when fear and betrayal collide, and this realization deepens her resolve to change the narrative not just for herself but for the generations that follow, even as she struggles with the fear that the family may never fully trust her again, that her actions, however justified, have permanently altered how she is seen, while Katie Logan continues her painful journey of self-reckoning, discovering that accountability is not a single confession but an ongoing process that demands consistency, humility, and patience, as she resists the urge to explain herself, to soften the truth with context and intention, and instead sits with the discomfort of being judged, misunderstood, and even rejected, realizing that true atonement requires relinquishing control over how forgiveness is given, if it is given at all. And this surrender challenges her deeply ingrained belief that she can fix things if she just tries hard enough, forcing her to accept that some wounds cannot be healed through effort alone, and that sometimes the most honest thing she can do is allow others their anger, their distance, and their grief, while Bill Spencer, perhaps the most resistant to change, finds himself in a prolonged standoff with his own identity, as the familiar strategies of intimidation and persuasion fail to restore the order he once commanded, and he is confronted daily with subtle but unmistakable signs of his diminished influence, conversations that stop when he enters a room, decisions made without his input, alliances formed beyond his reach, and these small indignities wound him more deeply than any public confrontation ever could, because they reveal a truth he has long denied, that his power was never absolute, only tolerated, and that tolerance has finally expired, and as this realization sinks in, he oscillates between rage and despair, tempted to reassert dominance through force, yet increasingly aware that such attempts would only deepen his isolation. And this internal conflict marks a turning point where the question is no longer whether he will change but whether he is capable of doing so before losing everything, as the family as a collective begins to grapple with what rebuilding might look like in the absence of old hierarchies, discovering that without Bill's control the structure they relied on feels unstable, uncertain, and frightening. And this uncertainty exposes how deeply they depended on dysfunction for a sense of order, how chaos feels unfamiliar not because it is new but because honesty has finally disrupted the lies that once made things seem manageable, and Steffi, observing these dynamics, recognizes that true healing will require redefining loyalty not as blind allegiance but as mutual accountability, a shift that demands courage from everyone involved, and as she attempts to model this through her own behavior, offering apologies without excuses and boundaries without hostility, she begins to understand how difficult this path truly is, how tempting it is to retreat into absolutes where heroes and villains are clearly defined, rather than navigating the gray spaces where responsibility is shared and growth is slow, while Katie's transformation begins to influence others in unexpected ways, as her willingness to accept consequences without self-pity challenges the family's long-standing tendency to deflect blame, prompting difficult conversations about complicity, silence, and the ways in which fear of conflict can perpetuate harm, and these conversations, though quieter than the slap that initiated them, prove far more destabilizing, because they force each person to examine not just what was done to them but what they allowed to happen, and as Bill watches this shift unfold, he is confronted with a choice he has avoided his entire life, to engage honestly with others without leveraging power, or to retreat permanently into isolation, clinging to an identity that no longer serves him. And though he resists vulnerability with every instinct he has, moments of clarity begin to pierce through, particularly when he recognizes that the respect he once commanded has been replaced by fear-driven compliance, and that even that compliance is now fading, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own authority, and this realization forces him to confront a painful truth about masculinity, leadership, and worth, challenging the belief that strength must be synonymous with control. And as the family stands at this crossroads, the narrative shifts from explosive drama to an examination of endurance, asking whether people shaped by betrayal and power struggles can learn new ways of relating to one another, whether forgiveness is possible without forgetting, and whether love can survive when illusions are stripped away. And Steffi, reflecting on her role in this unfolding transformation, begins to see the slap not as the defining moment of her story but as the fracture that made everything else possible, understanding that while it exposed the truth, it is her choices afterward that will determine whether that truth leads to destruction or renewal. And as she commits herself to a future grounded in integrity rather than reaction, she embodies the painful lesson that change is rarely dramatic, often uncomfortable, and always incomplete, yet necessary. While Katie's ongoing accountability and Bill's reluctant self-examination serve as parallel journeys that underscore the complexity of redemption, revealing that no single act can undo years of harm, but that sustained effort, however imperfect, can create the possibility of something different. And in this extended aftermath, the family learns that betrayal does not end with exposure, that healing is not guaranteed by truth alone, and that the hardest work begins after the shock fades, when the silence returns and each person must decide who they will be without the lies that once defined them, leaving them to confront the uncomfortable but liberating reality that while the past cannot be changed, the future remains unwritten, shaped not by power or fear but by the difficult, ongoing choice to live honestly in the ruins left behind.